From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I just signed, prior to walking in, an order directing Secretary Mattis to re-examine our military detention policy and to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay.
In his first State of the Union address, President Trump threatens to start sending more prisoners to Guantanamo and to keep the military prison open indefinitely. This comes as Trump repeatedly links immigration with terrorism.
In recent weeks, 2 terrorist attacks in New York were made possible by the visa lottery and chain migration. In the age of terrorism, these programs present risks we can just no longer afford.
And while 2017 was the second warmest year on record, Trump never mentioned climate change or global warming.
We have ended the war on American energy, and we have ended the war on beautiful, clean coal.
Today, we'll hear excerpts from the State of the Union and get response from Marumora Villalpando, a leading undocumented immigrants' rights activist who attended the State of the Union as she fears she faces deportation. We'll also hear from Ilhan Omar, a former refugee who has become the first Somali-American Muslim legislator in the United States, plus Bill McKibben of 350.org and Katrina vanden Heuvel, publisher of The Nation. We'll also speak to Daniel Denver on how deporting people made Central America's gangs like MS-13 and how more deportations won't help. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump read his first State of the Union address on Tuesday night, in which he called on Congress to pass an immigration overhaul and repeatedly tried to conflate immigrants, including Dreamers, with terrorists and gang members. Among Trump's guests to the State of the Union were the parents of a young girl who was killed by members of the MS-13 gang 2 years ago in Long Island, New York. 2 girls. MS-13 is a gang that originated in Los Angeles in the 1980s and has since spread to Central America as a result of the U.S. mass deportation policies. During the lengthy address, Trump also announced he'd signed an executive order keeping the Guantanamo Bay military prison open and escalated his warmongering rhetoric against North Korea, calling the North Korean government depraved, warning it poses a nuclear risk to the United States. Trump also celebrated his massive tax overhaul benefiting corporations and the richest Americans, among them himself and his family. Trump entered the State of the Union with the lowest approval rating of any president in modern U.S. history, entering his second year in office. We'll have more on the State of the Union after headlines. A federal judge in New York City says he will not ignore President Trump's, quote, vicious comments about Latinos as he considers whether to halt the termination of DACA. That's the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, which gives nearly 800,000 young undocumented people permission to live and work in the United States. President Trump canceled DACA last fall. But on Tuesday, Judge Nicholas Garofis slammed Trump for his vicious, recurring, redundant drumbeat of anti-Latino commentary. This is New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, one of 16 attorneys general who have sued to block the termination of DACA.
It's a massive, successful program that they're attempting to shut down. The issue of discriminatory animus came up, anti-Latino sentiment as well. It was a thorough hearing. The judge was very focused on the issues, very well informed, and we look forward to getting a decision.
This comes after a San Francisco judge also issued an injunction blocking DACA's cancellation earlier this month. In financial news, the drug giant Pfizer says it's reaping a staggering $11 billion gain as a result of President Trump's tax overhaul, which massively benefited corporations and the richest Americans. President Trump Trump and Republicans claim the tax plan would help the middle class, but a recent Reuters poll shows only 2% of surveyed workers say they've received any benefit from Trump's tax overhaul. Democratic lawmakers expressed outrage after the Trump administration announced it would not impose new sanctions against Russia, despite the fact these sanctions were enshrined in a law passed by Congress and signed by President Trump last year amidst concerns about Russia meddling in the 2016 election. Instead, the State Department released a list of prominent Russian political leaders and oligarchs. The oligarchs list is an exact copy of Russians listed on the Forbes magazine 2017 billionaires list. This is New Hampshire Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen.
Well, the Trump administration has had 6 months to configure a sanctions regime. Sanctions based on a vote, as you heard from Senator Brown, 517 to 5 in Congress. And what did they come up with? They gave us this list. This is the unclassified list. As Senator Cardin said, the oligarchs that are part of this list are taken from Forbes magazine.
This comes as the CIA Director Mike Pompeo recently met with top Russian officials, including the head of Russian intelligence. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA, is ending shipments of food and water to Puerto Rico today, 4 months after Hurricane Maria devastated the island. About a third of Puerto Rico has still no electricity. Some rural areas still have no clean running water. San Juan Mayor Carmen Yulín Cruz criticized FEMA's move while speaking at a gathering of Latino leaders in Washington, D.C., saying, quote, "While I'm standing here with you, there are children without food in Puerto Rico. We need the help, and it's not help. We have paid for it," Mayor Cruz said. She attended the State of the Union address with New York Senator Gillibrand. In Honduras, a delegation of faith leaders from the United States is denouncing the United States' support for Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernández, who's been inaugurated for a second term despite allegations of widespread voting fraud in the November 26 election. This is Reverend Kathleen McTeague of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee speaking outside the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa Monday.
We call on our United States government to withdraw its recognition of the fraudulently elected government in Honduras, and we demand the investigation and prosecution of both those directly responsible for and those behind the killings during the protests from November 27th till today.
In Colombia, longtime land defender and community leader Temistocles Machado has been assassinated in the port city of Buenaventura. Known to the community as Temis, he helped lead the massive 3-week-long civic strike in the Afro-Colombian city this past summer, which is protesting widespread violence in the region and a lack of basic services such as clean water. The Polish parliament has sparked outrage by passing a bill that would make it a crime punishable by up to 3 years in prison to suggest the Polish government was complicit in Nazi-era crimes. Opponents say the bill seeks to rewrite and erase the history of Poland's anti-Jewish pogroms leading up to World War II and the collaboration between the Polish state and Nazi Germany after the Nazis occupied Poland in 1939. In Turkey, more than 300 people have been arrested for posting messages online criticizing the Turkish military offensive against the Syrian city of Afrin, a majority Kurdish city controlled by a U.S.-backed militia. The Turkish government says those arrested include journalists, politicians, and activists. The government is accusing them of spreading terrorist propaganda by speaking out against the deadly military offensive. In Egypt, a coalition of opposition parties and pro-democracy groups are calling for a boycott of Egypt's upcoming presidential elections. The authoritarian Egyptian president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, is almost certain to win the March elections after nearly all of his challengers were arrested or disqualified. In Japan, a woman has filed a landmark lawsuit suing the Japanese government for sterilizing her without her consent because of a mental disability when she was 15 years old. She's one of an estimated 16,000 people in Japan who were forcibly sterilized under Japan's eugenics law, which was enforced from 1948 to 1996. In France, Oxford professor and renowned Islamic scholar Tariq Ramadan has been detained in Paris after he was accused by 2 women of rape and sexual assault last year. Ramadan has denied the accusations. And Gene Sharp, a lifelong advocate of nonviolent resistance, has died at the age of 90. Gene Sharp was most famous for his extensive writings on nonviolent struggle, which include the influential book From Dictatorship to Democracy, A Conceptual Framework for Liberation. He was also the founder of the Albert Einstein Institution, which is dedicated to advancing the study of nonviolent action. This is Gene Sharp accepting the Right Livelihood Award in 2012.
Nonviolent struggle or nonviolent action includes three categories of methods, specific means of acting. One, the methods of nonviolent protest that are symbolic activities, such as marching down the street or displaying certain colors. But this technique, if it had only that, wouldn't be worth much. It also includes the much more powerful methods of non-cooperation, such as social boycotts, economic boycotts, labor strikes, political boycotts, civil disobedience, and thirdly, the methods of nonviolent intervention and disruption, such as sit-ins, fasts, and the creation of new institutions.
Gene Sharp died Sunday at the age of 90 at his home in Boston. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump delivered his first State of the Union Tuesday, claiming this is, quote, our new American moment. He focused heavily on immigration, renewing his call for a border wall while linking immigration to terrorism.
In recent weeks, 2 terrorist attacks in New York were made possible by the visa lottery and chain migration. In the age of terrorism, these programs present risks we can just no longer afford. It's time to reform these outdated immigration rules and finally bring our immigration system into the 21st century.
President Trump never mentioned the words climate change or global warming, but he did acknowledge the recent deadly hurricanes and wildfires that devastated parts of the country.
To everyone still recovering in Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, everywhere, we are with you, we love you, and we always will pull through together, always.
That was President Trump's only reference to Puerto Rico, where today FEMA's ending shipments of food and water, even though about a third of the island still has no electricity over 4 months after Hurricane Maria struck. On the foreign policy front, Trump threatened North Korea again, suggested he'll start sending more prisoners to the U.S. military prison at Guantanamo in Cuba, where no new prisoner has been sent in almost a decade.
I just signed, prior to walking in, an order directing Secretary Mattis, who is doing a great job. Thank you. To re-examine our military detention policy and to keep open the detention facilities in Guantanamo Bay. Asking Congress to ensure that in the fight against ISIS and al-Qaeda, we continue to have all necessary power to detain terrorists wherever we chase them down, wherever we find them. And in many cases, for them, it will now be Guantanamo Bay.
The prison population at Guantanamo is currently 41, down from a high of 684 in 2003. President Trump also used the State of the Union to issue a veiled threat to federal workers.
So tonight I call on Congress to empower every cabinet secretary with the authority to reward good workers and to remove federal employees who undermine the public trust or fail the American people.
Well, today we spend the hour looking at what President Trump said and didn't say during his State of the Union. We begin with Katrina vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of The Nation, America's oldest weekly magazine. Overall, your response to what you saw last night?
You know, last July, Amy, at a rally in Youngstown, President Trump said, one speech isn't going to make me presidential. It takes a lot more than that. We heard platitudes and promises. We heard warmongering. We heard a lot about scams. I think, let me step back. You just were talking about Guantanamo. I think one of the ugliest moments was when the president cheered on his move to move the capital of the embassy to Jerusalem, along with reopening Gitmo for business. And you had a Republican Party. Let's not forget Trump is the head of a Republican Party, a radically extreme Republican Party cheering on defiance of international law and human rights. And I think that was a telltale moment, because that is what this administration is about on the foreign policy front. He is a false populist. He ran as an ethno-reactionary populist, but a populist. And last night was littered with broken promises, even as he promised more. I'm not going to hold my breath for lower drug prices, which he spoke of. I'm not going to hold my breath for more treatment of an opioid crisis, which, as you probably know, in 2016 there were more opiate overdoses than combat deaths in Vietnam. And he has scammed the American people with a tax cut I know you've talked a lot about on this program, which was essentially a handout to the very rich and the big corporations and to his own family. And last night he tried to boast that this was a tax cut for the American people. It is looting our future, what this tax cut does. It fails to invest in a future, which, if the Democrats were wise, they would put out a bold, bold plan in the next few days about what they would do specifically on these issues of jobs, of infrastructure, not a privatized infrastructure plan, of real health care, Medicare for all, of tuition-free higher ed, and get real specific about what they are going to do for working people in this country. And working people, by the way, of all colors, because there's too often pitting class versus identity, when in fact the working class is brown, black, yellow, white.
When you talk about pitting, there was direct references to immigrants taking poor Americans' jobs. But I want to go to that issue in a moment. But first to the foreign policy front, where President Trump said he would beef up the U.S. nuclear arsenal, dismissing global efforts to ban nuclear weapons.
As part of our defense, we must modernize and rebuild our nuclear arsenal, hopefully never having to use it, but making it so strong and so powerful that it will deter any acts of aggression by any other nation or anyone else. Perhaps someday in the future there will be a magical moment when the countries of the world will get together to eliminate their nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, we are not there yet, sadly.
That was President Trump in his first official State of the Union address. Katrina vanden Heuvel.
So before the nuclear issue, don't forget he also said he wanted to break the spending caps, this defense sequester, the parity between defense and non-defense spending, which is a major issue because so much already goes into defense, not making us more secure. Our Pentagon budget is at a historic high, rife with waste and abuse. We do not need more. With the modernization of nukes, I think it makes us less secure, and it is a continuation, sadly, of President Obama's plan to modernize the nuclear arsenal. He was going to throw $1 trillion, I think, over 3 decades. This is folly. What we should be doing is building down, de-escalating. What is striking, Amy, is that Trump as president has elevated the nuclear issue and the North Korea peril to a new high because people are concerned about his, quote, finger on the nuclear button. But we need to be concerned about the security architecture of a nuclear arsenal that is rife with possible accidents, false alerts, as we saw in Hawaii a few weeks ago. And I think at a minimum, we need to begin to take them off of hair trigger alert, the nuclear arsenal, and end first use. There is legislation in Congress, as you may know, from Ted Lieu and Senator Markey to ensure that there be some congressional involvement in any use. But President Trump probably doesn't know someone, I don't know how he feels about him, I know how you do, you know, Henry Kissinger, General Shalikashvili, Senator Nunn, former Senator Nunn, former Clinton Defense Secretary William Perry have all come out for the abolition of nuclear weapons, as have the majority of countries in the world through the General Assembly at the United Nations last year, putting through a treaty, 151 nations, I believe, to seek the build down and end of nuclear weapons. That is true security, not a president who talks and rattles his thumbs and his fingers and his Twitter feed against the leader of North Korea, nor is a president who tries to decertify the Iran agreement, which is in our security interest, and if it's broken, will lead to more nuclear proliferation and less security. This president is clueless when it comes to what real security is, and he's out of step with a majority of Americans who listened to him on the campaign trail when he spoke of the waste of $6 trillion in the Middle East, which could rebuild this country. Do you know, Amy, that counties where they've had lost so many sons and daughters to endless war voted for Trump because they believed he might end endless war. This country's not anti-war, but it is against endless war and seeks realism and restraint.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Katrina vanden Heuvel, our guest, editor and publisher of The Nation, America's oldest weekly magazine, will also be joined by State Representative Ilhan Omar. She is the first Somali-American Muslim legislator in the United States. She was in Washington, D.C. from Minnesota to participate in one of the alternative State of the Union events. We'll also be speaking with a woman who was inside Congress last night, who is a guest of a senator. We'll be speaking with Marumora Villalpando, who herself faces deportation, an undocumented immigrant just yards from President Trump. In addition, we'll be talking to Bill McKibben. The words global warming or climate change, climate chaos were not mentioned by President Trump, though he talked about beautiful coal. And we'll speak with a journalist, Daniel Denver, who's written an article for the Washington Post, among others, saying that U.S. deportation policies were responsible for gangs like MS-13. Stay with us.
I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do you? It goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, the major lift, the baffled can compose it. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof, her beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. She tied you to a kitchen chair, she broke your throne, she cut your
Rufus
hair.
Wainwright singing Leonard Cohen's song Hallelujah to the video of protests around the country. He was singing at an alternative State of the Union, a People's State of the Union, held at Town Hall in New York on Monday night. This is Democracy Now! As we look at President Trump's first State of the Union, spending the hour on it. On Tuesday night, some Democrats in the chamber booed when President Trump used the term chain migration and tried to link terrorist attacks to policies allowing recent immigrants to sponsor relatives.
The fourth and final pillar protects the nuclear family by ending chain migration. Under the current broken system, a single immigrant can bring in virtually unlimited numbers of distant relatives. Under our plan, we focus on the immediate family by limiting sponsorships to spouses and minor children. This vital reform is necessary not just for our economy, but for our security and for the future of America. In recent weeks, 2 terrorist attacks in New York were made possible by the visa lottery and chain migration. In the age of terrorism, these programs present risks we can just no longer afford. It's time to reform. These outdated immigration rules and finally bring our immigration system into the 21st century.
That was President Trump at his State of the Union. Joining us now, Minnesota State Representative Ilhan Omar, former refugee Muslim, the highest elected Somali-American public official in the United States. You were in Washington, D.C. from Minnesota to attend one of the alternative State of the Unions, Ilhan Omar. Can you respond to what President Trump said last night?
Thank you, Amy, for having me. I was sort of listening to that little bizarre bit about our immigration programs being outdated, and the only thing I could think about was his fascist ideas being outdated.
Talk specifically about these linkages he made, continually, this line he drew between young people coming to the United States over the border and MS-13 killing people.
And it is really disappointing, and it saddens me, but it doesn't surprise me that that this person can't comprehend how dangerous it is to create a link between people who might be committing some atrocious crimes to immigrants that are coming to this country seeking a brighter future for their children, and the countless people from Central America and South America who are coming to this country for opportunities that my family came here for, and many of the immigrants before us came. It is unbecoming of a president and a leader to be able to make those kind of disturbing and disgusting links.
You're a part of a group, as a young Somali-American Muslim legislator, of America's Cabinet, a nonpartisan project launched by young elected officials. Can you talk about what this is?
Yeah, we realized that this past year we could be in the streets, we could resist some of the horrendous ideas that are coming out of Washington, or we could get involved as young electeds who have fluency and understanding of what our constituents need. We believe we have bold ideas that are going to lead our country to be able to keep up with fulfilling its promise.
I wanted to bring Maru Mora Villalpando into this conversation, an activist and undocumented immigrant with the group Northwest Detention Center Resistance and the group Mi Gente. She attended the State of the Union address last night as a guest of Washington Senator Maria Cantwell. Maru, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about what the atmosphere was like inside Congress as President Trump spoke, and the significance of your being there.
Quite awful for me to sit next to a lot of people that were cheering him up. At some point, I was able to see him clap for himself. I decided to sit down throughout the entire speech. I did not clap at all. I did get a glimpse of other couple of people also sitting down. When we saw each other, like a young man at the same row that I was, but at the end of the row, we just raised our left fist to each other, trying to endure the whole entire speech that it felt really, really long. People stared at me when I didn't get up. Again, I saw a couple of people here and there not standing up either. And I think the most important thing for me, it was that Trump's police, Immigration Customs Enforcement, came to my house last month via certified mail, starting a deportation process against me. And when Senator Canwell's office called me and invited me to join, I felt that it was my opportunity to show Trump himself that we are not going to get intimidated. We are going to continue working. People in detention called me yesterday throughout the day and told me, we cannot be there, but you have been the voice. We have selected you. You have a task to do, and you have to be there and endure whatever he says. We knew it was a racist, xenophobic speech. He scapegoated my community along with many other communities. But it was important to show that we're not afraid and we're going to continue in the struggle.
Now, CNN reported that Congressman Paul Gosar said he requested U.S. Capitol Police arrest undocumented immigrants attending the State of the Union. The Arizona Republican, who's known as an immigration hardliner, tweeted his request that police consider checking identification of all attending the State of the Union address and arresting any illegal aliens in attendance, he said. Madhu, talk about your own situation, not only that you, might have been arrested right there, but in Washington State, you're a longtime, well-known immigrants' rights activist. But talk about the letter you recently got.
Yeah, on December 20th, as my daughter and I were heading out, we heard a knock at the door, and it was the mail person handing me a letter, and I saw a logo from Immigration Customs Enforcement. I knew exactly what it was, and it's called a notice to appear, where the government, the U.S. government, via Immigration Customs Enforcement, is beginning a deportation process against me, saying that I overstayed a visa back in '96, a tourist visa, and that I need to appear before a judge. It did not include a date, but included the location, which is in downtown Seattle.
I want to go back to part of what President Trump said last night about his immigration plan.
Struggling communities, especially immigrant communities, will also be helped by immigration policies that focus on the best interests of American workers and American families. For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans. Most tragically, they have caused the loss of many innocent lives.
Madhu Mora Villalpando, your response?
Well, I was trying to contain myself. It's easy to see how he was pinning people against each other, low-income workers or either brown, black communities, white communities, but also scapegoating my community, immigrant communities. It was really shocking to me to see how he utilized people's tragedies to blame my community, my immigrant community, for those tragedies. It was also even more shocking to see people of color there standing and clapping for him and really being used as we have been used in general in politics, but using people's tragedies to scapegoat our communities without talking about the real reasons why there's violence in our communities, created precisely by the same governments that created the conditions for why people end up being violent. I think that it was just a huge racist, xenophobic, nativist rhetoric. And again, I just tried to go throughout the night thinking, I have to be here, and I know that even though the majority of people there were clapping and standing for him, I knew that people outside would not agree with him.
In his State of the Union address, President Trump mentioned the MS-13 gang 4 times by name and told the story of the 2 young teenage girls who were murdered by members of the gang in Long Island. Let's go to that part of the State of the Union.
For decades, open borders have allowed drugs and gangs to pour into our most vulnerable communities. They've allowed millions of low-wage workers to compete for jobs and wages against the poorest Americans. Most tragically, they have caused the loss of many innocent lives. Here tonight are two fathers and two mothers, Evelyn Rodriguez, Freddie Cuevas, Elizabeth Alvarado, and Robert Mickens. Their two teenage daughters, Kayla Cuevas and Nisa Mickens, were close friends on Long Island. But in September 2016, on the eve of Nisa's 16th birthday, such a happy time it should have been, neither of them came home. These two precious girls were brutally murdered while walking together in their hometown. 6 members of the savage MS-13 gang have been charged with Kayla and Nisa's murders. Many of these gang members took advantage of glaring loopholes in our laws to enter the country as illegal, unaccompanied alien minors and wound up in Kayla and Nisa's high school. Tonight I am calling on Congress to finally close the deadly loopholes that have allowed MS-13 and other criminal gangs to break into our country.
That was President Trump last night as he talked about young people coming over the border and joining MS-13. Daniel Denver is with us from Providence, Rhode Island, writer in residence at Harvard Law School's Fair Punishment Project. Last year, he wrote an article for the Washington Post headlined, "Deporting People Made Central America's Gangs. More Deportation Won't Help." Daniel, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about his one of the central focuses last night, MS-13.
I mean, political rhetoric around immigration so often functions to obscure the reality and history of immigration, though Trump is a rather extreme case. And what his obsessive focus on MS-13 does, aside from scapegoating and facilitating the mass criminalization of Latino immigrants in this country, is obscure the origins and reality of gangs like MS-13. MS-13 was born in Los Angeles amidst the refugees fleeing President Reagan's dirty wars in El Salvador, and became a transnational gang that ultimately did so much to destabilize El Salvador precisely because of deportation policies pursued by President Trump's predecessors. This is a problem that's American-made through and through. So to treat it as though it's some external threat being foisted on Americans, it not only entirely takes out of proportion and exaggerates the criminal threat that MS-13 poses to Americans, it obscures the fact that it's our foreign policies, our military interventions, and our long history that unfortunately well precedes Donald Trump of mass deportations and criminalization of immigrants that created MS-13 in the first place.
And talk more about that as you fully develop it in your piece and your work, even why it's called MS-13, but to explain that history, Daniel.
Yeah, so Mara Salvatrucha was formed in LA in the 1980s. Older viewers are probably fully aware, and many younger ones as well, that in the 1980s, President Reagan was backing a right-wing government in El Salvador that was waging a brutal, dirty war against leftist revolutionaries in that country that sent huge numbers of refugees fleeing to the U.S. He also had similar dirty wars in Guatemala, as well as a Contra war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. But in the case of Salvadoran refugees fleeing to the U.S., Reagan made a point of denying that they were refugees, because how could his friendly government in El Salvador be sending refugees fleeing from their country if they weren't committing massive human rights abuses, which they were. And so coming into segregated neighborhoods in the U.S., where, like many poor people of color in this country, they were denied access to good jobs and good schools, young people gravitated towards gangs that were a thoroughly American phenomenon at the time, not one that they were bringing with them from El Salvador. And then in the 1990s, Bill Clinton's harsh anti-immigrant policy, which he was using as part of his general strategy of triangulation, attempting to placate rising right-wing anti-immigrant sentiment to ward off the right and consolidate white support in advance of to advance his own political ambitions, launched a mass crackdown on so-called criminal aliens, and those same policies were followed by George W. Bush and also by Barack Obama. And the result was that enormous numbers of people have been deported to Central America, including El Salvador. Some of them alleged gang members, many of them not. But those people being deported back into El Salvador brought Mara Salvatrucha and other gangs to that country and turned what was a homegrown LA phenomenon into a transnational criminal empire. Again, Trump entirely exaggerates the criminal threat that MS-13 poses to the US, but those gangs have played a major role in wreaking incredible violence and destabilization in Central America, in El Salvador. And that violence, that destabilization, along with US-backed mano dura crackdowns in the region, have pushed a new generation of refugees to come to the US. And now Trump has the gall to say that it's this new generation of refugees, young unaccompanied minors, who are a threat to us as Americans. I mean, it's absurd, it's offensive, and it's an insult to history, because U.S. policy has created MS-13 through and through. I think for Trump, it's just a convenient way to scapegoat and facilitate the criminalization of ordinary immigrants, which is something that he's been doing since he announced his campaign and said that Mexican immigrants were rapists and criminals.
And Maru Mora Villalpando, your response to that trajectory he made, the thread that wove through the fabric of his speech last night, young people coming over the border, MS-13, killing young women in Long Island, New York.
Again, it's just plain racist hate rhetoric that is trying to blame us for what David just explained. There's many different reasons why there's violence in this country. He obviously left aside all the other violence that white people have generated in this country. A lot of terrorist acts, but majority of them being done by white people in this country. To me, it's really, really offensive too that even the way he described children. We actually are working with a young man in the detention center in Tacoma. He's been detained. He came from El Salvador precisely, escaping gang violence. He came as a minor, and as soon as he turned 18, he was sent to the detention center. He already won his case, and the government, the U.S. government, decided to appeal his winning in court, in immigration court, and they still kept him in detention. He's still detained, along with another young man that we're working with, Manuel Abrego, that won his case, also from El Salvador, under the Convention Against Torture. The U.S. government appealed his case. He won back in November. He's still detained right now in the detention center. So this is just another way of keeping us in detention, making sure that our bodies, our brown and black bodies, are being used for profiteering, for, in this case, Geo Group to make more money, and for ICE to claim that they're supposedly creating a safe environment for us when what they're doing is continuing destroying our communities.
As you talk about violence, I wanted to turn back to Ilhan Omar, Minnesota state representative, the only Somali-American Muslim legislator in the country. Back in 2016, State Representative Omar, in Washington, D.C., you were attacked by a cab driver who called you ISIS and threatened to rip off your hijab as you were leaving a policy training at the White House. Shortly after the attack, you wrote on Facebook, quote, "The most hateful, derogatory, Islamophobic, sexist taunts and threats I have ever experienced. I'm still shaken by this incident and can't wrap my head around how bold people are becoming in displaying their hate towards Muslims." If you can talk about the atmosphere in this country over the last year, of course, I couldn't help noticing last night in the chamber as President Trump spoke, many of the African-American legislators, Congress members, were wearing African kente cloth whether it was scarves or bow ties, whether it was ties. Ilhan Omar, your response.
I mean, the rhetoric surrounding Muslims and Islam in this country has become a very dangerous one. When you sort of dehumanize and you normalize people's ability to take a violent action against individuals because they don't agree with the God they pray to, or they don't wear a clothing that you might approve. It sort of it starts us down a path that becomes very dangerous, and for a lot of our young kids in the schools, in workplaces, and just like I was roaming around the streets in D.C. Trying to do the work I was elected to do, you are faced with not only hate that comes in the form of verbally, but it gets very physical at times, and a lot of our communities are living in fear. It's the same thing with what's happening around the conversation with immigrants. With all the lies that are being told by the president and the Republicans, we are forgetting that immigrants in a lot of our communities are contributing economically. They are making the cultures of those communities thrive, and they, are not in that category of criminals, solely the contributors to criminal activity in this country, as the president makes it seem. I mean, if we think about our prison system, over 10% of the American population is imprisoned, and it's less than 5% of them are immigrants. We don't see a conversation, an outcry about what to do when it comes to white men who are being radicalized, who are going into our schools, in our churches, in our movie theaters, terrorizing our communities. There isn't a plan. There isn't a conversation. There isn't an outrage. I didn't hear a beep from the president last night about what he plans to do to keep Americans safe, so that they are able to go see a concert, so that they are able to feel comfortable sending their 5-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and 10-year-olds to school. And so when we are thinking about what makes America great, what keeps our country safe, is about having a principled leader who is seen as someone who cares about and is going to work in collaboration with other world leaders and really talk about the values of this country. Far too long, I feel like, we're letting fear drive our foreign policy. We're letting fear drive our domestic policy, and that makes us away from the actual values and the leading of with our morality that has gotten us to be the greatest nation in the world.
State Representative Ilhan Omar, the Virginia Democratic Congressman Bobby Scott tweeted, "Wearing kente cloth to the SOTU with my fellow official CBC members, Congressional Black Caucus members, to stand in solidarity with people from you-know-what countries." And I'm wondering if you, very quickly before we go to break, could respond to that comment. As a Somali refugee, when President Trump made that comment about the continent of Africa, talking about these S-hole countries, and what kind of blowback did you feel?
Yeah, my home country is included in that bleep whole countries, and I am proud. I've never been ashamed of where I come from, and I know that so many people have appreciated the fact that Africa and many of the countries within Africa are considered the birth of civilization, and we bring so much culture and enrichment to this world, and it is really important for people to have conversations about that, and to not only stand in solidarity, but to also speak up and speak out about those kind of vulgar words that the president might use.
Well, we're going to go to break and come back to this roundtable discussion in response to President Trump's State of the Union. Stay with us.
Señor presidente, le vengo a avisar, no tengo papeles para trabajar. Presidente, pregunto por qué matan al moreno con piel de café. Si fuera presidente, honestamente, si fuera presidente, para mi gente, si fuera presidente, honestamente, presidente, para mi gente.
If I Was President by Las Cafeteras, performing in Democracy Now! Studios. To see our interview and their performances, go to DemocracyNow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. As we spend the hour looking at President Trump's first State of the Union, President Trump referring to the extreme weather events that hit the U.S. last year, but never mentioning the words, climate change during his speech.
We have endured floods and fires and storms, but through it all, we have seen the beauty of America's soul and the steel in America's spine.
Well, President Trump never actually mentioned climate change. He had this to say about coal.
We have ended the war on American energy, and we have ended the war on beautiful, clean coal.
President Trump apparently added the word beautiful to clean coal because the transcript that was sent around did not say beautiful. Well, joining us now, Bill McKibben, co-founder of 350.org. Today he's taking part in an event in Washington, D.C. called Climate State of the Union with Vermont Senator, former presidential candidate. We'll see if he's a future presidential candidate, Senator Bernie Sanders. Bill McKibben, welcome to Democracy Now! Your response to the State of the Union last night.
Well, as you said, he barely mentioned and didn't mention what's probably the single biggest problem facing the planet. That's because he doesn't think it's a problem. The president is under the illusion that climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese. The stuff about coal was, I mean, by this point, everybody knows that clean coal is an oxymoron. The beautiful clean coal part was strange. It kind of betrays an impoverished fantasy life or something, I don't know. But maybe the scariest part was lauding ExxonMobil for its plans to invest another $50 billion building yet more pipelines and yet more fossil fuel infrastructure in this country. That's clearly where President Trump wants to take us. It's clearly flying in the face not only of climate change, but of the economics of energy, which wants to send us straight in the direction of sun and wind. This was a very, very backward-looking speech, not only on immigration, which was horrible to hear, but also on these questions about the future of our economy and our energy life.
Well, talking about the future, you were just here in New York a few weeks ago with Naomi Klein, standing next to New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. Can you talk about the significance of what happened?
Yeah, and actually this is the kind of important pivot here. I mean, when we do this big event tonight, this live stream that we're calling Fossil Free Fast, one of the things we'll be pointing out is we can't make the future we need in Washington right now. There's no hope of getting good legislation through Congress anytime soon, so we have to go elsewhere, to cities and states. New York City was a huge step along that path when earlier this month it announced that it was divesting $200 billion in pension funds from the fossil fuel industry, and that it was going to sue the 5 biggest oil companies for the damage that they've done to that city and every place else on the planet. It was a really striking moment, and there'll be many, many more of those moments going forward because cities and states are going to have to step up and fill the vacuum that President Trump and really all of Washington is leaving at this point.
After President Trump spoke last night, Senator Bernie Sanders recorded his own response to the State of the Union.
During the campaign, Donald Trump told us, quote, "The rich will not be gaining at all," end of quote, under his tax reform plan. The rich will not be gaining at all. Well, that was quite a whopper. As president, the tax reform legislation Trump signed into law a few weeks ago provides 83% of the benefits to the top 1%, drives up the deficit by $1.7 trillion, and raises taxes on 92 million middle-class families by the end of the decade.
That was Senator Sanders. The official Democratic response was Congressmember Joe Kennedy III. But what Bernie Sanders is saying and what he's doing tonight with Bill McKibben and others, the significance of his voice right now, just to explain.
So,
Katrina.
Of course, Bernie Sanders has a significant voice coming off the campaign of 2016, but I think what Bill said is so important. What's happening in cities and states, both elected leaders and movement activists, we are seeing the resurgence not only of citizen engagement and activism, but getting things done, whether it's California or New York City, but also Arcadia, Jackson, Mississippi. There's a lot going on in this country. And I think what Bernie Sanders is showing the way is Democrats can't simply, though they must, expose Trump's bait and switch on working people, the tax scam, but they need to lay out a bold, clear, alternative agenda, a kind of social contract for the 21st century. Trump last night had the chutzpah to talk about a 21st century immigration plan. As Bill said so well, what we heard last night was retro, was ugly nostalgia for a country that isn't going to come back through coal. And tell a kid with asthma about beautiful, clean coal. What we need are new pathways forward, humane, serious, and working with citizens and working with activists. So I think there's a real possibility. The bad news is Trump is president. The good news is, as Bernie Sanders said the other day, we've seen a revitalization of democracy and citizen activism. And people running for office, Amy, for the first time in years, people who never thought of it, want to change and take control of this country.
And
again.
Bill McKibben, in 2 seconds we have left, the event that's happening tonight, if people can't go directly, you're doing it online?
It'll be live in Washington and then online. And I'll say, when Bernie gets up to speak, I'll be thinking in the back of my head, it wouldn't have taken too many twists of fate for him to have been giving the State of the Union address last night. We should keep in mind that he's the most popular politician in America. So there's a lot to build on here, on climate, on immigration, on everything else.
I want to thank you all for being with us. 350.org's Bill McKibben, The Nation magazine's Katrina vanden Heuvel, Maru Mora Villalpando, who was in Congress last night, Minnesota State Representative Ilhan Omar, and journalist Daniel Denver. Thanks so much for joining us. We have a job opening, full-time news fellow. Submit your application. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.